Okay, good afternoon. Again, this is Guru Mike Schwartz. We'd like to welcome you to the FMA and Malay Arts Chronicles. This afternoon we have Guru Bob Orlando of the Kuntao system with us. Welcome, Guru Orlando.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Okay. Sir, again, just briefly, as we had discussed in our personal conversation, if you could briefly go into depth as to what initially brought you into the martial arts, please.
Sure. I was always a small, mouthy little kid when I grew up, and when I turned 17, I joined the Marines. And when I was in there, what they taught at that time, that was 1961, was basically judo. And for Marines, like, that was nice, but we'd always rather have a rifle anyway. So that didn't motivate me much. I saw some ROK Marines, Republic of Korea. A couple of years later, they were in an education class that we were in, and was watching them kicking telephone poles. They were doing Tang Sudo, and you'd see the wires vibrating. And that looked cool, and I watched a bunch of guys who were getting into that. And so what they would do is they'd go get a couple of 2x4s, nail them together, wrap them with burlap, pound on their hands till they were bleeding. And I got to thinking, you know, this is supposed to kill and maim the other guy, not me. So I never got into that one. Then after I got out of the Marines in '64, met my late wife. We married, but she was in poor health. And so that meant that I had to work 2 jobs. And one of the jobs was a day job during the day as a car wash assistant. And I would be out there working. Well, one day one of my coworkers got all bent out of shape about something. And he starts yelling at me, and I looked at him, and I said, "Don't yell at me, man. I didn't have anything to do with it." And I started to turn around and walk away, and he grabbed me by the shoulder, spun me around, smacked me right in the face. And I had 2 really fat lips because he got them both together. And at that time, it was a time where I just said, nobody's ever going to do that to me again unless I'm in the position to decide they get away with it or not. And so I started serious study of martial arts. I went and visited several Taekwondo schools, and I think one Japanese school, one Kempo school, which was primarily a combination of Japanese and Chinese arts, not like out of the Park or Kempo system or anything, and a Kung Fu school, and I found one that I thought was going to meet my needs. And when you don't know a lot about martial arts, you go to schools where sometimes you think it's good, and then after you're there, it takes you several years to realize, oops, never should have been doing that. But that was how I got my start. And 6 months after I got into that, Al Dacascos came to town, and I switched over to him, and I learned a ton of stuff from him. So that was my biggest boost, and he was the first of what I call my 4 significant teachers.
So at that time, I suppose you would say that after leaving the Marines and your brief interruption, if you will, at the car wash and seeking out instruction to assist in defending yourself, Grandmaster Dacascos' system of one-hop Kundo was at that point your primary system. Is that correct?
Yes. I was 6 months in that one Kempo school. The instructor I did not like, and I'm not going to name him or anything. And when Dacascos came to town, they were both in the same building, and so I got to see what he was doing. And then they had a problem. They split up, and then I went and followed him. I said, that's what I want to do. And so he was my first really big guy.
And what were the primary differences, and again, without naming names, of course, but what were the primary differences in the teaching styles and in the way that they presented their Kempo system that drew you to Mr. Dacascos?
Sure. The man who was doing that, I guess he got his first black belt in Kodokan Judo, and then he got into Shotokan Karate. He got his black belt there. Then he started hooking up with the Kajikembo system, and that's how he met Dacascos and Adriano Imperato and stuff like that. What he would do and what he would teach often seemed to be 2 different things. What he would teach was very, very hard style, very Japanese-like, fist chambered at the hip, large moves against a person firing a punch solely from a right lead with a straight right punch. And at first it looks cool when you see him take down people, but then the more you look at it, the more you realize, wait a minute, nobody punches like that. So you're practicing all this time to fight somebody that doesn't chamber their fist at their hip. If that worked, you'd see that in a boxing ring. And you see somebody speeding a straight right punch, and only martial artists seem to do that. That didn't meet my self-protection goals. And what Dacascos was teaching, and he really focused at the time on strong side forward, so I got into that very quickly, and he was very big on precision. So we would practice things a little more slowly, usually in largesse, but always with the idea of if it doesn't work in the street, if it doesn't hurt the bad guy, it's not going to do you any good. And so that was the big difference between those two, not to mention the fluidity of the Kung Fu that Dacascos was doing with his one-hop window.
And so how long did you spend with with Mr. Dacascos at that time?
I spent about 3 years with him. I got up to green belt, and then I ended up having to have back surgery. I had a lumbar laminectomy on L4 and 5, and he was doing a lot of high kicking stuff. And you can imagine with a bad low back, you couldn't do that. And then I got what they call an interspatial disc infection, which was really bad, and it just knocked me out totally for 6 months. I couldn't even stand up straight. So at that point in time, I was pretty discouraged. I had some equipment that I'd put together, heavy bags and this, that, and the other stuff. So I was out trying to sell the equipment just to buy food stamps, among other things. And I came across this Kempo school, and they were a very distant end of the Parker lineage. In other words, Parker taught this guy taught this guy, this guy taught my instructor. And he said, well, we can't afford to buy your equipment, but, you know, you can train here if you want. We won't charge you. How's that? And I said, well, here's the problem. And I told him about my back and this, that, and the other stuff. And he said, I think we can work around that. And sure enough, they were actually able to do that, didn't have to do any high kicks, things like that. And I was there for 3 years, and I eventually got my first degree black belt in that school, and that was done by the only black belt instructor I ever met that had a PhD in economics, and his name was Dr. John Cochran. And I've probably trained with, I think, 8 different people, some as a peer-to-peer training, most as teacher-student training, and Dacascos and Cochran were man number 1 and man number 2 in being my significant teachers who provided what I needed when I needed it. My only regret was my back operation, because then, I mean, I wanted to stay with Dacascos, and I probably would be to this day. But I think the good Lord said, nope, you want to learn self-defense? We're going to go this way. And that was the way it ended up going.
At the time that you were with Grandmaster Dacascos, did you ever meet his son?
Yes, I did, both of them. The one he had where he was the actual father, and the other where he was, say, the stepfather. But, yeah, I met both of them. It was really kind of funny because they were both about up to my waist height-wise when I met them. And then I didn't see them again when he left and went to Germany and this, that, and the other stuff. And I really didn't see him again till about 3 years ago, I think it was, when he came to do a workshop in Denver. And it was just such a joy to see him. And then I had seen his son in movies and things like that. And it was way cool.
So after you had achieved your initial black belt in Kempo under Dr. Cochran, where did you go from there? Did you continue to follow the Kempo system and the Kempo practices?
Well, yes and no. My Kempo that I did was very much focused on self-defense, and principles that Sifu Al taught I stuck with, like strong side forward. Also, when I would pull back my hand to make a punch, I always had a rule for me that the bulk of my forearm was always on my floating ribs, so I never pulled my fist back. And I stayed with a lot of the fluidity, a lot of the precision, a lot of the drills and stuff that he did. I'd forgotten where I picked them up from. And it was when I saw him again, 30-plus years later, I'm going, oh, that's where I got that. We call it this, and he calls it that, but dang, that's the same drill. That's where I got it from. So I kept a lot of what he did. I learned whatever was required in the Kempo system that I was in. After John Cochran, his small school didn't last, and so he went back to teaching in university, still does in the Denver area, and he went back to that, and I'm looking for someone to train with, and then I found another Kempo teacher, another Marine, and I trained with him for about 3.5 years and learned the forms that he had required, worked my way up in rank. I don't give that out to anybody. It's like the rank's not important. It's what you do when you're standing on the floor,
Right.
So I learned from him. From Dacascos, I got a bunch of really good principles early on that impact me even to this day. From Cochran, I learned how to fight. I was so afraid of fighting, it was pathetic. And so we fought all the time, and it was crash and bash. We wore lots of pads because we were nailing each other. And it gave me the courage to realize, oh, you can take a lot of this. You don't want to take it unless you have to, but if you do, you don't go down, and the stuff we're doing is practical. So he met that, what I would call the sand quota. You got to have enough sand inside that when you get hit, you suck it up and you keep going. So he gave me that. But I didn't have a lot of confidence, say, in the self-defense techniques that I had received to that point. And it wasn't because the techniques taught weren't any good. It was when they were taught to me, by whomever they were taught to me, I wasn't ready to really be able to internalize them. So when I got to Ron Carlson, he was the Kempo teacher I trained with next, and he's the next, what I call significant guy. And I number them 1, 2, 3, 4, but it's not in the order of their significance. It's the order in which I met them.
Sure.
And so he had some terrific self-defense. I'd watch him do self-defense techniques, and I'd go, that is cool. I got to learn how to do that. And so I picked up a lot of the self-defense techniques that he had. And some of the forms that he taught, I looked at, and I told him, Ron, and he was so gracious to let me call him by first name. I said, Ron, you got great techniques. I don't really like the forms, but you got great techniques. And he's just such a class act. He said, okay, keep working on the techniques. And like I say, I earned additional rank from him. And then his school closed, and about 6 months or so after that, there was a martial art workshop, sort of an expo, where we had several people come in, some local, some from out of town, and one of them, his name was Willem Detoires. And Detoires is a Kuntao Silat player. He plays them both, mixes them well together. And I wasn't training under anyone at the time, and for whatever reason, I was invited to be one of the demonstrators at that expo. And with the other people that were there, I kept thinking to myself, I don't have any idea why I'm here. All these people are, miles over me. But I went ahead and I demonstrated it in Chaco form, and one that I'd won plenty of tournaments with, and I broke it down, explained it, and then I got off the floor and I watched these other guys do their things, and I watched Detoires do his thing, and watched his students doing their own take on what he was doing. And I'm going, wow, this guy's cool. Well, it turned out we were over there by the table where they got the snacks, and he came up and he said, you're pretty good. You training with anybody right now? And I said, well, no, not now. And he said, do you want to train with me? And I'm going, well, yeah, sure. So he invited me up to his place, and I went up to his house one Friday night, and we were down in his basement, and he said, throw a punch at me. Well, one of the things that I learned from Dacascos was if a master ever asks you to throw a punch, do not miss. Do not slow it down unless he asks for a slow one. Let him have it. Give him the respect. And I did. And, of course, my arm almost fell off of my body from Mr. Detoires just whacking the heck out of it. He said, good, good. Now block this. And he threw a punch, and I nailed the sucker. And he shakes his arm, and he says, You'll do. And so I started training with him at that time. And he was my last significant instructor. I mean, I studied Filipino stuff. I studied Iaido. I studied Aikido Jiu-Jitsu, all kinds of other things. But those four were the significant. And the fourth one, what Dutwar's brought to me it was like just introduction with him and seeing what he did was catalytic. It tied so many things together with a fluidity and with a potency that just made me, I mean, I'd sit there with my jaw, dropped, my mouth open going, wow, how do you do that? And it was just a tremendous learning experience. And then he hooked me up with one of his senior students at the time, George Moore, and George and I hit it off. At first we had sort of a rough time. We hit each other, and I was used to being whacked all the time, and yet sometimes people that he would work with, they'd get upset if he hit them because it's like, well, you don't have the right to hit me that hard. And so he thought I was trying to bump up a bit. And then it took a little while, and he realized, no, this is just the way Bob plays, and we've been brothers in the art ever since. And I've learned so much from him. I would have to say almost as much as I've learned from Bill, because you can only learn so much from a teacher since you generally don't really hit the teacher hard. It takes a lot for you to put that kind of contact on him when you're trying to learn something. But two students can crash and bash with each other and try these things out and sit down and analyze them afterwards. And George and I did that. I mean, we had more bruises. We just whacked each other a lot.
So George was your primary training partner at that time?
Yes. Later, another man who was a Kempo player, a man who I consider in my mind the toughest martial artist I've ever met, Stuart Lauper is his name. Stuart wanted to meet Bill, and I hadn't seen Bill for a while. And so I said, well, sure, let's go set it up. So I set it up for us to go see Bill, and Stuart and I went up there, and Bill was really enamored with Stuart. I mean, it's hard not to be. He was just a great guy, a tough martial artist, a smart martial artist, and a man with tremendous compassion. And so training with Stuart then, when we would go to Bill, it would be Stuart and I and Bill. And we have tons of video footage because we would tape what we were doing so we could go back and study it and break it down and whatnot. We got tons of video footage of us training together with Bill. And so Stuart became a very big training partner. George had a shoulder injury from his job, so couldn't crash and bash with him. But Stuart and I were both used to hitting people and getting hit, so it was a really good time for us, and we learned a lot. Both of us did.
And so that was within Penchak Sawat, or was that considered Kun Tao?
Both. What Bill would do, and I really need to clarify this, when I started training with Bill, because I didn't know what the rules were for how you meet and greet and this, that, and the other stuff, Indonesian and Dutch Indonesian players. And he wasn't my teacher at the time. And so when I had met him at that expo, he said, you can call me Bill. So I did. And then when he asked me to train with him and I started training with him, I kept calling him Bill. And he said, my blunt American friend, you can call me Bill. So I kept doing that. So I don't mean that out of any disrespect. That's what he said. My own students call me Bob. I don't use any honorific titles, so it's a pretty natural thing for me to do that. But again, I mean no disrespect to Bill. But we would learn whatever Bill was teaching, and Bill frequently, and this is just my personal opinion, he would teach his students what he had that he felt best fit them. He was teaching Philip Salas, and Philip was a short guy, so he taught him a lot of monkey style and this, that, and the others. Then he would teach George a little differently than he would teach this guy and this guy and this guy. And for me, he said, Bob, you're a crasher and basher. I want to give you a lot of Kun Tao. But you learned both because you couldn't really pull the silat out of the Kun Tao. If you did, you were back on classical Kung Fu. And it was like there were principles and methods that he used, which you just never saw in other places. At least I didn't. And he would bring it out and you would see it. Like I said, his input for me was catalytic. It brought out so many other things. And then after training with him, you'd step back and see something and you'd say, oh yeah, look at that. The same move is done. A little different, but it's done over here in this art and in this art. And it's really funny about martial arts. If what you do is good, you will see it in other arts. If what you see is bad, you won't see it in other practical arts. A couple hundred years ago, you wouldn't see it because the people doing it died. Nowadays, you might see it in, Karate Mart or, McDojos or wherever you're going there, but you won't see it in a real fight. And what Bill did was show you stuff that you could use in a real fight, whether it was Kuntao or Silat. Sometimes you could question him and ask him, well, where does this come from? Where does this come from? And so he'd sit there and share with you all kinds of information about where he got it from. And if you look at his lineage, he studied with almost as many Kuntao teachers as he did Silat teachers. And his forte is not, say, as one who can keep each thing separate. Again, this is just my opinion. He just naturally blends them together and draws the strengths out of each and incorporates them. It flows right from one to the other, to the other, to the other. It's incredible to see him do it. So we say that he teaches Kuntao Silat. That's what he says he teaches. And I sort of amplify that by adding to it the fact that it's Dutch Indonesian as opposed to, say, traditional Indonesian or contemporary Indonesian, either one.
Now, you had made a statement a little bit earlier that you had said that you really could not pull the Silat out of the Kuntao or vice versa, because then you would be back to Chinese Gung Fu. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that, and exactly what do you mean by that?
Okay. Now, this is personal opinion, no reflection on staff or management of any martial arts system or its subsidiaries or its subsides. But when the British came over here to the United States and tried to force the United States to paying taxes without representation and this, that, and the other stuff, they brought their troops over, and their troops fought in straight lines, and they fought, with this unit firing shots across at this unit. You'd drop enough people, and pretty soon the guys who got off the most rounds and got the most shots were the ones who won. Then after a while, the Americans got smart enough and said, no, wait a minute, let's let them stand out in the middle of the field, and then we'll fire at them from the woods. We'll just fight dirty. And the British didn't get it. Had they gotten it, they had all the firepower. Their weapons could be loaded far more rapidly than ours could, and could get off more rounds, and they had better disciplined troops. We had militias. They had guys that were professionals. So they really could have wiped us out, but they didn't get it. They kept playing by their rules. The Chinese, as they moved from China down through and into Southeast Asia, had their own little rules. They would face each other, and they might wave their arms around and show their stance, and the other guy would wave his arms and show his stance and do their own salutations. And so one guy could identify, okay, he's doing the tiger system, this guy's doing this guy's doing praying mantis, whatever it was. And then they would charge each other. So it was like a sparring match. When they got to Indonesia, the Indonesians didn't play by those rules. And so it was like walking up to a cat, starting to pet the cat, and then the cat just jumps on you, scratches your face off, gets off, and then you're going, what was that? And in my opinion, the Chinese had to go back to their fighting roots, away from the classical artistic side of it, to their fighting roots. And since they were in Indonesia and Malaysia, they were able to, and I can't speak a lot about Malaysia with specifics because my training is more Indonesian, but they were around it all the time. They saw the Silat all the time. The Chinese were very secretive. They wouldn't show theirs to hardly anybody. But you were in that environment. It was like what would happen if I went to Brazil. I guess I'd have to learn Portuguese because people would be speaking Portuguese all around me. They wouldn't have to learn English because I'd be one of the few people down there, say, that did. I realize there are a lot of people down there that do, but you get my point. So they were picking up these principles: shearing, adhesion, whiplash, gyroscopic rotation, capturing the limb. To the Chinese, an elbow was a short-range weapon. to the Indonesians, yeah, that's true, short-range weapon, but you have a long-range, a mid-range, and a short-range elbow. And their take was different. Their style was different. And the Chinese, to survive, had to adapt. And so you can go to Indonesia and find Chinese schools where you have a range of their Indonesian input. It can range from, no, we don't do anything Indonesian, to, man, we got so much Indonesian stuff, our Chinese art don't look Chinese anymore. It looks more Indonesian. And you have all the people in the middle, you know, that whole spectrum. And what Bill did, in my estimation, was one of the best combinations of a Eurasian perspective. So you had that Dutch influence on the Indonesian part of it. Instead of standing up in front of your opponent and dropping to the ground immediately before he starts stomping on you, which didn't make a lot of sense to most of the Dutch. They said, well, if you're on the ground and I'm still fighting, I guess that's ground fighting. So he had that Eurasian perspective. Then he had the Chinese influence because he was able to train with Chinese guys. Then he had the Indonesian influence because he would train with them. And by his own admission, he would take what he tried in the Chinese school, and if he was training with an Indonesian school at the same time, he'd go over there and try that stuff over there. And then he would take what he learned in the Indonesian school, and he would try it in the Chinese school. And back and forth. Now, it didn't make him a very popular student, but boy, did it give him a wealth of knowledge. And so, generally speaking, my own personal opinion is that Kun Tao, done at the age and that time period that was taught, that Uncle Bill learned it, was a combination of Dutch Indonesian, Pukulan Penjak Silat, and Chinese Kun Tao. For those who had access to both, they would put them together. But the Kun Tao, to say Kun Tao Silat was almost redundant, because if you took the Silat out of Kun Tao, they were back to their classical stuff.
So then, what would be your immediate opinion? And specifically in regards to, let's say, the Lunada system of Kun Tao. When Grandmaster Lunada moved from the Chinese, the softer forms that he had within his system, and moved more towards the Japanese or Okinawan type of forms that they had developed for the system, and stopped teaching the softer forms. Do you feel that somehow took away from the origin of the Kun Tao, the Filipino Kun Tao that he had developed initially?
Well, I'm really not familiar with him or his system. So whatever I would say about that, you just have to take it from the point of ignorance. I don't mind proving my ignorance. I do it all the time. If I can't laugh at myself, then I get offended when somebody else.
No, and I understand. I didn't mean to put you on the spot necessarily, but
no, that's okay.
What my thinking is, for opinion's sake, so to speak, being that we somewhat established that the Chinese did have some direct influence upon the Indonesian and Malaysian systems, do you feel that moving away from that would take away from Kun Tao in general?
Yes, my personal opinion would be yes, it would, and I would scratch my head as to moving from a more fluid to a more rigid system would be, to me, counterintuitive. As you get older, you can find all these Korean masters and Japanese masters who have been doing it for 30 years, and they have a tremendous amount of fluidity that their students don't have. Part of that comes from aging. Part of that comes from injury. Mm-hmm. Because when you're young, you think, okay, I can face 1,000 pounds of force, and I can give him back 1,000 pounds of force. But after 15, 20 years, you start thinking, this is taking a toll on my body. So follow the Taoist method. And the Taoist method, if you're studying for self-protection, many will start with Qingyi. And that's a crash and bash, meet 1,000 pounds of force with 1,000 pounds of force. But then after 15, 20 years, they start looking at Bagua, going, wow, you can learn how to meet 1,000 pounds of force with 100 pounds of force. But you've got to be a little more relaxed, a little more fluid, move better, etc. So they start doing that. And then after about 10 years, they say, wait a minute, I see these Tai Chi players in Boy, some of them can meet 1,000 pounds of force with 10 pounds of force.
Mm-hmm.
So injury and aging compel us that if we want to keep doing this, we actually have to be more fluid. I saw Bill, when I started with him back in 1984, he moved differently then than he does now. That's a natural thing. My students who have been with me, because I've had my school now for 27 years this year, students, I've had some of them with me for 22 years, and they say, Bob, what you teach now and what you taught then are very different. When you first started, you taught more sparring, for one thing. We don't teach sparring at all now, because I don't want to practice kicking a guy in the chest or kicking him in the head when I'm standing here with 1 foot 6 feet off the ground. Now, the only time I kick him in the head is after I get him on all fours. You get smarter, and you do want to train smarter, not harder. And I think a lot of these masters who trained in really hard styles all learn the same natural lesson. As you get older, you have to get more fluid, and that makes you quicker. And the formula for impact is the square velocity times mass, which means if I can just increase my velocity by 1%, I'll get a huge increase in impact. But if I increase my mass by 50%, I won't get a 1% increase in velocity. So how do you get velocity? Long time practice for good lines and relaxation. So it doesn't seem natural to me to go from a more fluid art to a more rigid art. That'd be just my take on that one thing. And again, I've never met the man or seen his system.
In your particular personal development and within the system that you teach and your methodology of teaching, you said that your students obviously have seen a difference in the way you teach today as opposed to 27 years ago, as you said, in regards to sparring aspects and so forth. Is there any other particular adjustments or micro adjustments that you've made, particularly within your particular system? That you can point out that have made a difference for you?
Oh, yes. Gosh, yes. When I was training with Bill, one of the things that happened was I had a cervical fusion. 3 vertebrae in my neck were operated on and fused together, and there was a year that I really couldn't crash and bash with anybody. I was able to videotape a lot of his classes. Now, that was different than like the lessons that Stuart and I had with Bill, where we had a friend of ours taping it. This was me standing back, using the camera, seeing Bill do it, seeing the other students do it, seeing comparison contrast, seeing how Bill would do this with one student, do it a little different with another student, doing a little different with another student, and he was always, trying to see what would fit each student the best. And you get that, what Ed Parker referred to in the Parker Kempo system, that third-person perspective. You got first person and second person. That's the 2 people that are fighting. And there's the third person, which is the guy standing across the street. Got to watch the whole thing. So I got a whole new perspective, and there were things that I learned from Bill that weren't verbalized or taught, either by George or by Bill or by anyone else in that system. Things that you really had to stand back and watch. And it was like learning almost osmotically, just absorbing it or being irradiated and having the radiation hit you. You'd see him step in here and do a particular blocking method, time after time again. You'd see him step in and his leg was always in this position. He was following a rule that we use for leg work. My lead leg shin oriented on my opponent's near leg, period. Doesn't matter if it's a left leg or right leg, it's always oriented on it so that I can bend my knee and manipulate his, bend it and smash his, whatever. And it was that leg work and that realization of what was being done, and I'm going, wow, you can be this close and smash a guy with your knee. And if you do it right, your knee is about 2 inches below his, so it's not like you're going to go kneecap to kneecap. Or you could roll his knee, or you could grind on his knee. You got these 2 guns above your waist that are really good, and you can use them open hand, closed hand, elbow, fist, you name it. Now you got these other 2 guns below you, and they can do more than kick. And you can be so close you can use an elbow and at the same time smash him in the knee because he's 7 inches taller than you. Smash him in the knee, he bends over. Now you can put that elbow and have your meet and greet. So I would say the biggest thing that I've tweaked is my demand for self-defense being my top goal, and seeing it in the leg work, and then working it and working it and working it. I can't remember learning leg work drills when I was learning from Bill or training with George or anyone else. But after watching him and seeing what he did, it was like, well, how do we propagate that? How do we pass that on to our students? And it came about because my students were saying, Bob, are you aware that you're doing this? And I'm going, well, no, because I'm able to see them, but not me. And they said, you are. And then I'm saying, okay, well, let's play with it. And so we do exploratory martial arts time, and we play with it. And then being a system software engineer, I would look at something and say, we can do this. And I would come up with our leg drills that we teach in fighting footwork of Kung Tao and Silat. And those were drills that I put together simply because, oh, we can practice this move again and again and again. And I tell my students, they are only drills. They're to get you comfortable in those positions and moving from here to here and always keeping the pressure and always following the leg work rules. And once you're comfortable, now you apply the reflex you burned into yourself into a real fight. Without ever having to think about it, it'll be there. And several of my students who are in law enforcement have said, Bob, like one of them was saying, we had this one guy, and I had him in arm lock, and I was ready to cuff him, and he was on PCP or meth or something, and he just straightened out his arm. And we're going, uh-oh. And his partner was a Muay Thai player, and he elbows at the guy in the head, and obviously opened up a nice, gash in the guy's skin on his head, but ended up taking 7 stitches on his own elbow. Then my friend just smashes him in the leg, drops the guy to the ground immediately with a very painful leg, and it's not like smashing him in the thigh. You're going for that knee joint area. And he took the guy right down and handcuffed him. It works, and we've used it again and again and again.
Interesting, very interesting. So in respect, and you're obviously published numerous times. You've done a number of video works in specific for Paladin Press. Which
right.
do you find? Which material do you find has been the most useful that you have produced that other students have come back and said, just, this is phenomenal stuff. This is just some of the things that we use as a basic foundation for what we teach now when it comes to realistic martial arts drills. What do you think has been your most profound work?
From sheer volume of material sold, that would have to be reflex action. When I did my first video, it was meant to be a companion video to Indonesian Fighting Fundamentals, the book, because in the book you can talk about the power of observation and what a great learning tool it is. You can talk about Kunlun Pai, the heart of Willem de Tours. You can talk about Mustika Pritong Silat that Jim Ingram was teaching and its history and stuff, but that's not material that goes on a video. On the video, it's the Gucci that goes on there. The books are where you get the substances, the underlying reasons why. Now, if you do a video well, you give them as much of the substance as you can without boring them. The first one was to show them principles that were paralleled in the book, and it worked out well. And a lot of people will come back and say, man, that was so cool to see that, to see it at the speed that it matched the book. And the book has gotten great reviews. Then reflex action came out, and I always have a rule with my videos. Do not repeat what you've put on a previous video. That would cheat the customer. That's just not fair. You shouldn't have to pay twice for the same information. So if I make a reference to something that was in the first video, then it's a brief reference, no more than 10 seconds, and we move on. Now they've got the point. Now this is what we've done. There were some drills that we changed, added things to. Over time, they just evolved. Instead of hitting the guy in the head, well, we've got more short people. We've got a few tall people. Can't hit him in the head with this one until you whack him in the ribs or the groin first. Now I can hit him in the head. So we would make those adjustments. So reflex action tied a lot of the hand skills together, which a lot of people want. And that's probably been the big seller. The next one after that is actually the fighting forms of Kuntal Silat. That one has been well received. I'm a firm believer, even though I went from a perspective of thinking form sucked to a perspective of these things have value, and break them down, show them how they can be used, recognize that whatever way you show them can be used, it can be used a dozen different ways depending on who you're facing and your skill level. That one has been very well received, and I would say that's probably my number 2 bestseller. The one that seems to be kicking off more and more, at least by copyright violations on the Internet, is the Fighting Footwork DVD series, which is 485 minutes long, I believe. A 4-volume set, lots of details. It is a training video, so there's not a lot of Gucci in it. You don't see a lot of flash. It's how to learn and build a reflex that you always find yourself doing, so when the fight occurs, you're in the cocked and watch position. That one is taking off a lot better now, maybe because the folks saw the others and thought, well, maybe I should go back and look at this again. But that'd be about the order in which their importance has gone across, and it really ties to the human nature. Humans work with your hands your whole life. First thing you do is, you're out of the womb, your daddy puts his finger in your palm and you grasp it. Okay, that's a reflex. Another one that you have is putting your hand in your mouth, and you do that whether you're putting a milk bottle there or a Coors Light. Doesn't make any difference. You're practicing the same line. So if you can practice a blocking method that capitalizes, that flows with that, oh, you can do that faster than anything because you've done it your whole life. And so that one was real popular and still remains real popular because people want to learn hands first. After that, they start to think about the other things. Oh, wow, your legs can do this? Very interesting. And that's the way it seems to take off naturally.
So do you work with weapons at all, with the rattan sticks or any other form of weaponry within your system?
We work with the Filipino systems. We work with baton and knife. Our knife is not the same one that you would see used if you were Filipino and practicing espada, edega. It's not a dagger. The knife that we train with primarily has less than but it's a wooden knife. It has less than it's about a 4-inch long blade, and it has about a 2.5-inch long handle. It's hard to hold on to, single edge. And that's a little, in other words, it's supposed to be hard to hold on to. It doesn't matter how expensive your knife is. If you can't hold on to it, it's not going to do any good. So we train with one that's harder to hold on to. We train with one that is only about 3/4 of an inch longer than the one you can legally carry most places in the country. Not all, but most places in the country. The dagger is twice the length. The handling characteristics are totally different. As a Marine, I'm perfectly comfortable with a bayonet, a K-bar, and now as a civilian, I'm perfectly comfortable with a short knife. The short knife doesn't thrust. It slashes. You want to use switches, not timers. Cut his forearm, you have a switch. He has a tough time holding on to his weapon, whatever it is. Cut his carotid artery, you have a timer. He still has 2.5 minutes to pull out his gun and put, 16 rounds in you, whatever he wants to do. So we go from that approach. We don't use the Indonesian weapons. We use the Filipino ones because their success, their effectiveness has, in my opinion, been proven. And I've seen it again and again. We don't use rattan. The ones that we use are polycarbonate. We usually get them in Monadnock. I think it's called the PLP 24. They don't make the 24 anymore. They make the 26. That's because it's closer to the real weight of an oak one if you had it in your hand. It's polycarbonate. They guarantee it won't break, which means that we're not hitting sticks most of the time, just hitting sticks. We're hitting the other guy's baton because I don't want to smash his knuckles. But when we do, we practice hitting with the last 6 inches of our baton on the last 6 inches of his baton. If I can whack the last 6 inches of his baton with the in 6 inches of mine, that means I can pick off his hand more easily. Then we go through a lot of sombrada range drills where you're going more slowly and practicing for the precision. So we use the baton and knife. For the knife, we practice that same sombrada range drill with a knife. We practice it with a reverse grip using the knife. We practice it with a screwdriver, because one of my students was attacked by a guy with a screwdriver. And if you only practice with a knife, how do you slash with a screwdriver? Well, you don't. So how do you disable with a screwdriver? You go for joints, and you learn how to do that. So we practice with a short screwdriver. Then we practice with a butcher knife. The butcher knife is because if some perp is out prowling your neighborhood, he doesn't want to get caught being armed. So he breaks into your house, goes to your kitchen. What does he pull out? The little steak knife? No, he pulls out the big butcher knife. It has totally different handling characteristics. So if you're going to use it because he brought it upstairs to your bedroom to fight, and it ended up out of his hand and now it's in your hand, you better know how to handle it. So we use a lot of Filipino flow drills, tools, modified again for my requirement that it must be effective for self-defense. I'm not trying to preserve some national art. I'm trying to preserve my family and myself. And that changes your total perspective on what you will study and why. It doesn't take anything away from other people. For example, I love to go to Danny Inosanto seminars. I don't play. I just want to hear what he's got to say. I'll pay my money and listen. And you learn so much. I studied Garrote Larense for a while. And then Danny Inosanto talked about Garrote. And from the Filipino perspective, there was a little difference. But then there was that similarity, and you would tie the pieces together, and you get great knowledge. And I think that knowledge is critical if you're going to study martial arts for self-defense. But for every individual, they have to decide, why am I training? What is my objective? And for me, it's always been self-defense. And for me, when it came to choosing weapons, and personally, I prefer the ancient art of Ching Ching Pow. That's a 45. But other weapons, impact and edge weapons, I chose to go with the Filipino side of that. And I prefer the Serrata Eskrima of all the methods out there because they use a short baton and they get closer. And that very strongly coincides with the way we do our Kuntao Silat. We close the gap. We're in on the guy. I mean, we even make some Serrata players uncomfortable because we're too close.
So so in other words, you utilize portions of the Serrata Eskrima system within the weapons that you teach, within the weapons, the way you train with weapons, the way you train with weapons.